Well, South Africa's president talks urgency, but he delivers drift. The Mdlanga Commission, meant to expose criminal syndicates in the police and justice system, couldn't even find chairs and a venue on time, a symbol of a presidency long on promises and short on execution. Editorials now describe urgency as rhetorical and delivery as optional. And as I argued recently, Cyril Ramaphosa governs as a conciliator in chief, not a true reformer, and the result is what we've seen in the economy: drift, decay, and fragility. Growth below 1%, unemployment entrenched at above 33%, reforms stalling, and investors increasingly ask, who leads after Ramaphosa and where do we go from here? Quo vadis? Well, I'm Michael Avery, and this hour on the Monocle Banking Podcast, I'm joined by political analyst and author Moeletsi Mbeki to cut through the noise and to talk very frankly about where we find ourselves today. Moeletsi, it's in the spirit of the national dialogue, and I know there have been some who have been rather cynical about the outcomes and what we can possibly hope to have another powwow. But just broadly, what are your thoughts on the national dialogue and what we've seen so far with the foundations pulling out and then coming back in, and lots made about this just being another talk shop?
Well, I think there are two sides to the national dialogue. There's a positive side, which is not actually what is being talked about. The positive side that I see in the national dialogue is that we're having a situation where a ruling party, which was elected to some extent, is leading a coalition government, but it has been a ruling party for the country for the last 30 years. And it is admitting that it has run out of ideas. It has no solution to the country's problems. I think that is unique in the world of politics.
Yeah.
Certainly in the world of African politics, it is unique. So the ANC leader, the ANC president, who is the president of South Africa, has gone to the population to say, look, folks, I have no new ideas for your problems. I know what your problems are. And he enumerated what these problems are: poverty, etc., etc. And he says, I have no solution. Can you please come up with a solution? So that, to me, I think is positive. I think it's positive in the sense that if you compare this to Robert Mugabe, for example, to ZANU-PF, Frelimo in Mozambique, or MPLA in Angola, these are the ANC's fellow liberation movements. They are the only one amongst these liberation movements. They were meeting here a few weeks ago. The ANC is the only one that is honest enough to say, we've run out of solutions. Can the people now come up with what should be done? So I think on that side, that is a big positive. Now, whether we, the citizens, have a solution to this, that's another matter. But at least we know that the largest party in South Africa, the oldest party in Africa, is admitting that. But the other positive side about it is that it accepts the verdict of the voters. You see, if you think you still have answers, but the voters are rejecting you, which is what happened to the ANC, then you go into rigging elections and doing all the things that happen in Mozambique, that happen in Zimbabwe. But the ANC is admitting that the voters are right. They have no solution. So I think there's a lot of positives about the national dialogue. Now, will we, the citizens, do we have a solution to South Africa's problems? Well, we have as many solutions as there are speakers.
Yeah.
And that's a lot of speakers, because South Africans love speaking about our problems. So I don't really think we have a solution. I have my own resolution that I want from the national dialogue, which is the introduction of single-member constituencies for national members of parliament and for provincial members of parliament. Yes, combined with a proportional representation system.
Right.
I think Germany has something similar to that. I think Israel also has something similar. So it's been done before.
So mixed PR constituency, similar to what Van Zyl Slabbert thought 20 years ago in order to engender greater accountability?
Yes, I think we need greater accountability. One of the big problems of the government of South Africa is that the proportional representation system makes members of parliament accountable to other members of parliament, which is the party leaders. So actually, there's no accountability whatsoever. And this is why one of the biggest drivers of corruption in South Africa is because there's no accountability at the level of decision makers in the government. The members of parliament are accountable to other members of parliament. So then there is no accountability system. The only system that is a kind of holds them back is the judiciary, and especially the Constitutional Court. But that's not the job of the judiciary. The job of the judiciary is to try bad guys.
Yeah.
It's not to make the government accountable to the judiciary. But this is one of what is happening to the South African political system because of lack of accountability of our electoral system. So yes, let's give it a try.
Yeah.
Through the dialogue, you never know whether we will come up with some solution. But for me, that's the solution I would like to see. And to go further, for the president to stand for election and for premiers to stand for election, to be elected individually like happens in many republics, so that they get elected whether through a constituency or standing on their own for a presidential or premier position. Those are the outcomes I would like to see come out of it. That firm resolution on sorting out our electoral system so that there's accountability to the government. And that resolution will then go to Parliament. Of course, Parliament may or may not implement it, but at least they will have a firm resolution from a large group of people, of South Africans, whether the national dialogue is convened by its citizens or convened by the government. As long as they come up with that resolution, I will be very happy with the national dialogue.
So how are you in your capacity pushing this forward? Because obviously there's a group of individuals who've been selected, an interesting selection of people. You've got from the captain of the Springbok rugby team to former beauty pageant winners to former politicians, civil society leaders. As far as I'm aware, I'm going back into my memory banks here, but wasn't there an Electoral Act amendment bill or something floating around to that effect that was conveniently brushed under the carpet a couple of years ago?
No, there is actually, as we're talking now, there is a committee chosen by Parliament to review the electoral law. And this committee is supposed to go and report to the Minister of Home Affairs, and then the Minister of Home Affairs takes their report to Parliament. So there is a committee sitting. In fact, they have had this so-called consultation with the public. Now, we all know what the consultation with the publics look like in this country.
Just look at the NHI. Yeah.
Well, exactly. So I attended one of the so-called consultations with the public. They had a conference at Emperor's Palace, of all places, to consult the public and to discuss their thinking about national dialogue. We had a very nice free lunch at the expense of this working committee or selected by Parliament. But what struck me about it is it had quite a lot of the people who opposed the Van Zyl Slabbert to start with and have been opposing. Remember, there was an effort by Vali Musa to also try and bring back the issue of constituencies. They also oppose it. Now, I saw some of them as being committee members of this investigating committee, which was, by the way, it was appointed by the 6th Parliament. It wasn't appointed by the 7th Parliament. So you can guess what that committee is going to, what recommendations is going to come up with, either a huge fudge, which leaves everything as they are, or some incredibly complicated thing like those, you remember, the independents. It'll be so complicated that the voters won't know what to do with it, so they won't bother to vote for them.
Yeah.
So the status quo remains. So that is my expectation. of that committee that is now sitting to to look at. So we need an independent voice like the people who are participating in the national dialogue to raise this issue of constituency.
And I was actually listening to your brother addressing the SA Communist Party a couple of months ago in the build-up to the national dialogue, and really stressing the importance of his and fellow comrades putting their voice across at this dialogue, because it is going to be, what sounded from his words, quite binding on the way the president takes the various inputs forward. So, I mean, that would sound like it is slightly more serious than some of your more cynical or jaundiced commentators might think at the end of the day. Do you hold out that kind of hope? Because there are others who, to your earlier point about the committee, worry that it is just another fudge and another screen behind which the status quo can persist.
No, I think the national dialogue is good for airing all the grievances that we as citizens have about the performance of the government up to now. But at the end of the day, we have a constitution in South Africa that spells out how national decisions are made. And we don't want to deviate from that, because the minute we can amend and do all sorts of things, but we have to follow the constitution. And the constitution is very specific that the laws of South Africa originated from the executive, and then the minister concerned puts a draft of the law into parliament, and then committees go through the whole thing until eventually it gets adopted as law and then signed by the president. Now, we don't want to deviate from that. So even a private member's bill still has to go through that process. So we can't have another body sitting outside parliament making laws for South Africa. No.
Sure.
That is undermining the constitution. We've lived under the dictatorship of the National Party. We don't want to reproduce anything resembling extra parliamentary writing of laws, because then that's a very slippery path.
But it can at least provide the mandate with which to reinvigorate the investigation into changing the current political system into that mixed PR constituency system, which, to your earlier point, had slowly run aground under the sixth administration. When you look at the president's tenure and where he is now, some 25 months out from an elective conference in his second term, he arrived in 2018 with a huge task in trying to repair so many broken institutions that had been wrecked through the Zuma years of state capture, as we well know and has been well documented. And to kind of mixed success. I mean, if you look broadly at the reform agenda, trying to fix the economy, Treasury produced that paper on fixing the network industries. And so the focus really was on primarily state-owned enterprises like Eskom and Transnet, and to get those working, stop load shedding, turn Transnet around, and to see some more micro reforms introduced by Operation Vulindlela help support a broader base from which we could grow. Now, here we are in 2025, growing at 1%. The reform tracker released by Business Leadership South Africa shows that a handful have been achieved, visa reforms in particular. Many remain kind of on track but unresolved, and another handful are flashing red in that there's political obstruction. How would you characterize the president's tenure and this great hope that we had as a reformer versus what he's delivered up to this point?
Well, I'm one of the, I think, strong judges of President Ramaphosa. But at the same time, I understand his problems. The ANC is a complicated organization. And the ANC is coming from another era. I think this is what we all have to accept. It's coming from a past of the so-called big church. And the big church was where a huge amalgam of interests came together in order to get rid of apartheid, in order to fight against apartheid. I was giving a talk at an F.W. de Klerk conference, and I was listing the number of enemies that the National Party apartheid regime accumulated over the years.
Yeah.
It's a very long list. It accumulated the list of the black South Africans, of the English-speaking white South Africans, of the Indians and the colors, of the American Congress, which passed laws against it, of Sweden, of China, of the Soviet Union. So it had a huge array of people who were against it. So this huge array of people who were against it were the broad church.
The broad church. Yes.
They were the broad church. Well, now they get rid of the apartheid regime. Okay, for the first 5 or 10 years, the broad church holds. But of course, that broad church was going to start to fracture. And it inevitably started falling apart. And then its ability to operate and to make decisions gets weaker and weaker. And that's what has happened to South Africa. So where we should be going in South Africa is that we have to start the emergence of new types of political parties that represent real socio-economic interests, instead of the broad churches that we still have, which represent a multitude of social groups and social classes. And some of them, actually, especially many of the newer parties, they're actually civil society organizations masquerading as political parties. So, we are a capitalist society. We're one of the most successful capitalist societies in Africa.
Yeah.
So our politics has to reflect that, which means we have to come up with new political parties that represent socioeconomic interest groups rather than the broad church that our history has been about to oppose the party. So we need parties that are left-leaning parties that represents workers and those constituencies. We need center parties that represents capital and its allies and so on. So South Africa has to have 2 or 3 parties that reflect the real socioeconomic groups that we have in our society. Then our democracy will become more accountable. What we have right now is poor Cyril is trying to keep the broad church together, but it's falling apart. Look at the Communist Party. He's walking out of the alliance, and he's desperate, trying to keep the Communist Party inside the tent.
For the longest time, I thought they should go and contest elections on their own.
Yeah, look at the unions. You see, National Union of Mine Workers is now supporting the Communist Party, but it's still in alliance with the ANC. So you are having the broad church has become a dog's dinner. Let me put it that way. And you can't govern a country, especially with the problems that we have with a party that is a dog's dinner. It has to have clear social economic interests that it is trying to advance, and the voters have to have those choices. Do we go with a center-left party? Do we go with a center-right party? Do we go with a center party? But it must represent socioeconomic interests. And then if let's say, a center-right party wins, then it must implement the policies which it tabled in the manifesto that it gave to it. Whether I agree or disagree is not material. If the voters vote for a center-right party, then that center-right party must implement the policies that it took to the electorate. So I'm looking forward, ironically, to the demise of the broad church. Well, my family was part of building this broad church, which is the ANC. But the ANC is now an obstacle to the maturity of democracy in South Africa, which is the democracy that should give us political parties that really represent socioeconomic interests that can then make decisive direction about where our economy should go.
I think it's a really interesting analysis because it would explain much of the paralysis with regards to implementing. That's what frustrates me initially when you hear about a national dialogue and the ANC as the governing party having run out of ideas, because they are very good ideas. As someone who, through an economic market lens, would definitely characterize myself as a center, maybe even center-right conservative, Ricardo Hausman has done great work on this as well, in simplifying the role of the state, removing the role of the state, freeing up private enterprise to unleash growth, trying to weaken the monopolies that were inherited under the apartheid regime, which we're starting to do, but very fracturedly with political pushback. If we just see what Eskom is doing with the unbundling, they don't want to fully now unbundle certain assets. They just want to lease them out. So, and would explain why you see this inability to move forward, because again, you're trying to move forward with policies that would sit well under a particular political characterization, a centre-right party, but within a broad church configuration. And so you can't move forward. So where does that leave us then as we build up? Obviously, we've got the local government election next year and then the ANC elective conference. As it's currently being contested inside the ANC, do you see the ANC as we know it ceasing to exist beyond the 2029 election? How does this play out if you're a business leader trying to make head or tail of whether or not we will ultimately see a more mature political dispensation with a complete fracturing of the broad church?
Well, I think if I'm a business leader, I have to realize this is my country. I have to shape its politics. The politics it has today are paralyzing the country. They are paralyzing my business. They are paralyzing the economy. So they have to start to say, we are going to come up. We have to intervene in the political space and become participants instead of onlookers who want some good outcome to come from the goodness of the heart of either Cyril Ramaphosa or Helen Zille or John Steenhuisen. They have to come up and say, we need a political party, let's say, of the center-right. And this is what the political party of the center-right should look like. Now, remember, during the anti-apartheid years, the biggest capitalists in this country, which were the Oppenheimers, were in politics.
Yeah.
They took part in politics. They stood for parliament. Ernest Oppenheimer was a member of parliament. Harry Oppenheimer was a member of parliament. The new biography of Harry Oppenheimer, one of the amusing parts, if you recall, was he supported, I think it was a Liberal Party or some liberalish party. And this liberalish party wanted to abolish migrant labor. So Harry Oppenheimer said, okay, guys, I support what you say, but can you delay the abolishing of migrant labor just for a little while?
Yeah, which, as we know, was a huge underpin for South Africa's mining finance houses.
Yeah, of course. So South Africa, we have the advantage compared to many countries in Africa. We have a very powerful and a very stable private sector, and a very big private sector, both on the business side, but also on the civil society side. What gets forgotten is that civil society is part of the private sector. The unions are part of the private sector. So we have lots of strengths in South Africa. But because we're so uncertain about this broad church thing, because it's almost became into our DNA, we are not willing to ditch it and come up with parties that will solve the country's problems. But I think it will come because the voters certainly have rejected the ANC.
Do you think the voters would be ready for a centre-right party that represents the interests of capitalists in society, entrepreneurs, businesses, when the profile of capitalism still seems to be painted with such racial overtones? And I'm not saying we're in the years of white monopoly capital as espoused by Jacob Zuma, but there is still very much the sense that even in the BEE debate, when you start to point out the failures in black economic empowerment, immediately you're called all kinds of things, and you're called anti-transformation, and you don't accept our history and the need for redress, which, you know, as someone who's been hugely critical myself of BEE, and I know you have as well, that's not the point we're trying to make. The point is that we need a more normalized society, but BEE has enabled an elite and enabled corruption. Very difficult to have that conversation, though. It's so easy to paint people with these racial jibes. So how does a new party like that find broad-based support in order for it to get the popular mandate to execute on its economic agenda?
You have to be careful not to be intimidated by extremes. The characters that you're pointing out who will accuse people who oppose black economic empowerment with sound arguments, but they accuse them of racism if they're white, or if they're black like me, they say, well, you are a sellout to the white man. But the reality of the population of South Africa, you were saying, will they accept a party of the center-right with capitalists and whatever? The answer is yes. The most trusted institutions in South Africa are civil society and the private sector and business. They are the two most trusted institutions in this country, which means that people, the great majority of South Africans, irrespective of race, they want to hear what the private sector has to say, what solutions it is proposing to put on the table, because they trust it already, because it delivers. Every morning it delivers food on the table for the whole population of South Africa. So they trust it. So it's a myth that the mass of the population of South Africa are against business. They are not. You have a few fringe elements who are against business, which is fair enough. I mean, all societies have their fringe elements, and they are free to say what they say and articulate what they articulate and accuse whoever they want to accuse. But the reality about the opinions that are measured every year in South Africa show that the private sector is very legitimate in South Africa. But the leaders of the private sector are afraid to stand up and say, this is where the country should go. That is more the problem. It's not that the people will instinctively reject a message coming from business.
Do you think that is partly the reason behind why in years gone by we have seen business leaders, Rule Khoza springs to mind as chairman of Nedbank, Tony Treyer when he was CEO of Anglo, business leaders, when they did find their voice and stick their heads above the parapet, particularly calling government out on various failed policies, were quickly attacked by ANC leaders, and so, then retreated back into their lane, so to speak.
Yeah, but in politics, you get attacked. I mean, I get attacked all the time.
You have to have a thick skin in this game.
Yes, you have to have a thick skin. When BE started, which was in the early 90s, I think I was the only person who was against it. And I said that BE is going to obstruct the emergence of black entrepreneurs. It wasn't even that it was benefiting the elites, although, again, I was against that. But it was my major objection to black economic empowerment was that it disincentivizes black people from becoming entrepreneurs and incentivizes them to become junior partners and small shareholders in existing businesses. Now, that's not how you build a new economy for a newly democratic country. So that was my objective. But I got all sorts of, in fact, Dr. Motlana, the pioneer of black economic empowerment, who set up New Africa Investments Limited with Sanlam, Nail, he reported me to Mandela for my views on black economy. And he sent a message to me through a third party saying that if he ever met me in a dark alley, he will donor me for opposing. So the business people, if they think they have a solution to the country's problem, never mind what the ANC says or the PAC or whoever else or the DA, they should stand by their own principles and hopefully take it to the electorate.
Yeah.
And they will be surprised how much of the electorate supports the private sector in South Africa.
Fascinating. And I mean, your point around BEE as well, ironically, in that it disincentivizes the creation of emerging black entrepreneurs. It incentivizes the creation of white, and what we've seen is white Afrikaner entrepreneurship thrive because they've felt that there's no alternative. And so it's almost as if it's doubled down on the old, architecture of the apartheid economy that the ANC inherited. And it's interesting now, it hasn't been 30 years of BEE. It's been, roughly 2 decades and some change. I was reading in The Economist that One of their leaders the other day called on BEE to be scrapped outright. Given that it's now a much more mainstream view, do you think we'll have the courage to tackle this particular issue at the national dialogue and the maturity to say, right, it's time to sunset laws this particular policy?
Well, I hope so. I mean, if the national dialogue is as free as it is claimed, it will be and not guided by the ANC. Effectively, which up to now it has been guided by the ANC. The ANC bankrolls it through the state. It decides who to invite and who not to invite, and so on and so forth. But if it really becomes this free forum, then I'm sure the issues of BEE and its viability and its contribution and its end, those issues will be debated in the national dialogue.
It's very interesting, though, that Overton window of what is politically acceptable now is not as fringe as it was in the early 90s when you were very vocally critical. It has become a lot more acceptable to challenge this, and it was a
even
a
Donald
holy
Trump.
cow. Well, yeah.
Even Donald Trump has jumped on my bandwagon, let me say, which is the anti-BEE bandwagon.
Speaking of Trump, and Mcebisi Jonas was saying that there is now a concerted third force type campaign to muddy the waters, to link the president to MTN and its dealings in Iran and Afghanistan, and this kind of concerted attack on the ANC for its principled stance on what's been going on in Gaza. How much of that is just smoke and mirrors, and how real is that potential threat to the ANC of being sanctioned by the US? And how do you see that then impacting the makeup of the leadership of the ANC? Because that's a frequent question that I get from business leaders, Moeletsi, is who comes next? After Cyril Ramaphosa, the deputy president is Paul Mashatile, and in tradition, it's the deputy president that tends to, ascend to the highest office inside the ANC and then become president of the country. Paul Mashatile has all kinds of corruption clouds hanging over him at the moment. I've heard that Josienza Ramakgopa might hold some kind of aspirations, and then Patrice Motsepe's name has also been bandied about. How do you see that playing out?
Well, the good thing about our present electoral system is that it doesn't matter who the president of the ANC is. The president of South Africa is elected by parliament. The ANC doesn't have a majority anymore, and it is unlikely to get a majority. So whether it's some angel or some devil becomes the president of the ANC, they have to be elected by parliament. Cyril Ramaphosa, Paul Mashatile, Thoko Didiza, the Nationals, they were elected by the DA. They wouldn't be sitting at union buildings if it were not for the DA, because they had to go through parliament to be elected. And the ANC didn't have a majority, and the big opposition parties, which is MK Party and EFF, were never going to vote for Cyril to be president. So Cyril was put there by the DA. So if the ANC brings somebody that other members of parliament don't like, they won't vote for him or her. So I'm not too worried about who becomes president of the ANC, because the president of the country is no longer determined by the largest party. It is now determined by a coalition of parties that decide. So if the ANC puts forward a candidate who the DA in particular doesn't like, they'll vote against it, and that will be the end of that. So I'm not too worried, and I think we shouldn't worry ourselves too much about who succeeds Cyril. It mattered before when the ANC was a majority party. It doesn't matter today who is the president of the ANC, because there is nothing that says that president of the ANC will become president of South Africa.
And the GNU, I mean, if you look at trends, even in by-elections, it doesn't look like the ANC is going to reverse the losses in the coming elections. So a coalition government is almost guaranteed, and it's now just a question of that coalition calculus and how you see that playing out. Just as we wrap up, Moeletsi, for this new political formation that represents capitalists and business people to be born, what would you like to see happen right now in order for that idea of yours to become reality?
what we need in South Africa is a production-driven coalition. Right now, we have a consumption-driven coalition. The coalition of the middle classes, the coalition of organized labor, of civil society. These are consumption-driven coalitions. We need a production-driven coalition. But who have the vested interest in driving production and even at the expense of consumption? It is business and it is the poor, especially the perennial, the victims of structural unemployment. So that is actually at the heart of our politics, is that the consumption-driven wing of our politics revolves around the ANC, around the DA, around COSATU and the unions, because they want consumption. But to change the economy of the country so it absorbs the 40% unemployment, we have to focus on production. And the only groups left in our society who want production are the unemployed, the marginalized, because they don't want to live on social growth, and business, because South African business has to be competitive.
Yep.
You know, I was reading an article, I think it's today or yesterday, in Business Day about the South African banks going to East Africa. But for them going into East Africa, they have to compete against banks from Asia, against banks from Europe, from all over the world. So our productive institutions like our banks have to be competitive globally. And you don't get competitive globally by sitting there and eating and getting fat. You become competitive by being lean, mean, and very hardworking. And that's where South Africa should be going.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that coalition will come about.
Interesting that today we have the news as well that Yanni Mouton's foundation, the brains behind PSG and, the early investors in Capitec and one of the early investors in Curro are proposing to buy out Curro, which is, you can argue that a school is a public good and should it be listed, and there's this kind of profit motive versus public benefit motive. The structure of the deal is going to place it into a public benefit organization structure. And that will further, with patient capital, the aims of providing quality education to more people, to more children. And again, to your point, because there's this vested interest in driving the productive side of the economy to create better skilled, employable citizens into the future and that future workforce as well. And so I do see the alignment there, but it needs leadership.
It needs
that's
the crux.
Leadership is absolutely the fulcrum around which this will all pivot. Are you having those conversations? Are there any leaders out there at the moment who are receptive? Who is that next Harry Oppenheimer?
Well, I don't know who the next Harry Oppenheimer will be, but I think the private sector leaders realize, to tell you the honest truth, that something similar to this has to happen. Now, who the leader is and how that should be organized, how it should be structured, I think we are still not clear, because remember, people like my generation, we are still in the world of the big church and of consumption. So people are nervous about standing up in public and saying we need a production-driven agenda in South Africa. But I have no doubt it's going to come.
Yeah, well, the window seems to be right now an opening wider with each passing day, as we realize that the status quo will never deliver the kind of reform and prosperity and future prospects for South Africa and for our children that we all absolutely hope and dream for. And that energizes me, because that leader will emerge given that kind of the ingredients and the ground that you've just sketched as well. Moeletsi Mbeki, thank you very much. Author, political commentator, and shall we say provocateur here on the Monocle Banking Podcast. Thanks so much for your time.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for having me.